Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It's so good to see so many familiar faces popping in to this training. If you don't know me, I'm Leora Svanko, the Senior Program Manager for the Oregon Arts Commission. Just here to welcome you to this training. We're so glad you're here. You may have attended the training we did 2 weeks ago, and I hope you got a lot out of that one. And if you're new to this training, welcome. Glad to have you. We are so glad to be partnering with SMU Data Arts to put together these trainings, these building blocks for small organization trainings. Today, we'll be talking about chart of accounts, really to support you in your work. I know that there's a lot that you're up to as leaders of small arts organizations, and the Arts Commission is really committed to increasing our support, trainings and technical assistance to organizations that we serve to really help empower you to do the great work that you're doing. So I just really appreciate your commitment to your own professional development, and thanks for all the work that you do in your communities. Again, we're hoping to provide more trainings in the future, so keep us posted on what needs you have and how we can serve you better. So thanks for being here. You'll have a lot of opportunity to ask questions in the chat and at the end, and I just hope you have a really, really great time today. And I'm gonna pass this off to our Executive Director, Brian Rogers, to say a few words.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for attending today. Yes, and just to underscore what Leora was saying, capacity building is a huge thing that the Arts Commission is very interested in supporting across the state. And just a few words about the data arts. Years ago, I was one of the founding members of what we called back then the Cultural Data Project. That must have been, I don't know, 15 years ago or so. And we worked with the Pew Charitable Trust, the Heinz Endowment, the William Penn Foundation, and the Pittsburgh Foundation to create the original concept was a unified way to collect financial information from organizations. But it's amazing to see how data arts has grown into this really wonderful way for organizations to, manage their fiscal and non-fiscal data, and not only report to their boards and what they're doing in their community, but also to funders. So appreciate you showing up, and thank you so much. And I think I'll turn it over to Katie.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brian. And it's good to see you, Brian. And just a huge thank you to the Oregon Arts Commission and Brian and Leora for supporting today's webinar and making it possible for us to be with all of you here today in this virtual space. So my name is Katie Ingersoll. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the programs director at SMU Data Arts. I'm a white woman in my late 30s with medium length brown hair, glasses, and a black cardigan. And I'm also going to take a moment and introduce my other SMU Data Arts colleagues here. Monica Lewis, our engagement manager, is with us. Monica will be facilitating and managing our chat and assisting with questions that come in through the chat. And Rochelle Brisson, our programs and office coordinator. Rochelle will be in the background to support and provide technology assistance during our time together. Monica and Rochelle, I'm going to turn it over to you for just a moment to provide your pronouns and your physical descriptions for folks.
Thank you, Katie. Hello, everyone. As Katie said, I'm Monica Williamson. Lewis. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm wearing a white blouse. I'm an African-American cisgendered woman in my mid-30s. I have twist natural hair with a green and white polka dot headband.
And hello, everyone. My name is Rochelle Brisson. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a woman in her mid-30s with shoulder length brown and pink hair, and I'm wearing a green and teal blouse. And I'm so happy for you all to join us today.
Great. Okay, thank you both. So before we do get started with our content, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the land we're on today. While we are coming together on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge all the importance of the lands which we each call home. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the First Nations people. We specifically honor the Apache, the Caddo, the Comanche, the Coushatta, the Tonkawa, the Wichita, and the affiliated Kichi, Waco, and Tawakoni and Lenni Lenape peoples, upon whose traditional territories SMU Data Arts now exists. And I do want to invite everyone, if you would like, to share your own personal and local land acknowledgement within the chat, since we're all coming from different areas, if you would like to do so. A few housekeeping items. With that, I mentioned the chat feature just now. It's a good time to find it. We'll be using the chat for any questions throughout the webinar as I'm doing the presentation. We'll also be sharing links to resources and additional content that we referenced today. Monica will be keeping an eye on the chat and we'll answer any technical questions that come up. And we'll also have time at the end to answer questions. I did mute everyone as you were coming in. We are in a meeting room, so you are able to unmute and ask questions out loud during our Q&A, which is it's really great to hear from folks, but I'm going to ask you to stay on mute throughout the presentation just to minimize background noise. For anyone who would like to activate the closed captioning feature, that is available to you, and you can just simply click the CC icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You may then be prompted to view closed captioning by live feed or by transcript. You can choose whichever one works for you. And finally, we are recording today's session. We will be sending a follow-up email with resources we mentioned in the presentation, a link to the recording that you can share with others, and a brief survey to get your feedback. So look for that from us within the next few days. And finally, I do just want to share that the information that I'm sharing today, we call this building blocks for small organizations. It's really geared for maybe new organizations that aren't audited, organizations with smaller budgets, or really anyone at an organization of any size who's less familiar with nonprofit financial management. So this material is kind of basic on purpose. If you are, a more skilled person in nonprofit finances, we're so happy to have you here today. Maybe we can also learn from you in the Q&A, and you'll be able to fill in a few gaps in your financial knowledge. But that is sort of where we're starting from today, is trying to, get those building blocks in place and for the basics. So I just wanted to give that context. So let's go ahead and get started. All right. So although your work revolves around creativity and culture, all of us are here to further creativity or do creative work in our day-to-day. Understanding how finances work is still key to successfully managing your day-to-day activities as an organization and planning for your future. In the session 2 weeks ago that Monica led, we touched on a few questions that you might be asking about your work, such as, how can I plan for changes to my contributions and grants if things don't go as planned in my budgeting process? How much will it cost to offer online programs, or how much will any change to my programming that I'm thinking about making cost? And how will you cover your costs as an organization? Do you have a plan for that? There are multiple ways that data is used for financial management to answer these types of questions, ranging from how you keep track of data in the first place to the various reports your board might review at every meeting. So we like to think about these different ways of using financial data as building blocks for financial health. Just the tools, methods, and best practices you can use to help get your organization on solid financial footing and stay there. In our session 2 weeks ago, Monica talked about the annual budgeting process. If you missed that session with Monica, we will put the recording in the chat, and it was sent out afterwards, and we can get that recording to you. Today's session will focus on a couple of other important building blocks: organizing your financial data and building and modifying a chart of accounts. Before we jump into that, however, I know that most of you do know about DataArts and the CDP, but for those of you who don't or who are less familiar, I'm just going to give a brief overview of our organization and what we do. SMU DataArts is a program of the Meadows School of the Arts at Southern Methodist University. And here you can see just a little bit about what we do very broadly. We build capacity for data use in the sector. That's what today's webinar is all about. We collect high quality longitudinal data on the arts sector. If you fill out the cultural data profile and have supplied your data, you're part of that data collection. We develop data collection methods to respond to evolving sector needs, and we provide insights from the data that people can use. We also are, in addition to doing data collection, we are a research center, and we produce a lot of interesting research that's available to all of you as people working in the arts sector. So that's just a little bit about who we are and what we do. So here are our goals for today. By the end of today's session, I hope you will understand the importance of financial data organization, know what a chart of accounts is and how to create or modify your chart of accounts to best suit your organization, and leave with resources to explore with staff and board members. So we all come to this workshop with different roles at your organizations. I myself work in a programs role at my organization, but we all have sort of different functions. We have different missions, we have different capacities we come with, but no matter what your role is, your job most likely intersects with your organization's finances in some way. You might be a board member who has fiduciary responsibility for an organization. You might be the person who does all the financial data entry, whether you want to be or not. You might be a program manager who looks at financial reports on a regular basis, or maybe you're a one-person shop and you're really doing everything. At this point, I would like to invite everybody here to find that chat feature I mentioned and just share with us what your role is at your organization and a few words about how your role intersects with financial data. How do you use that financial data day to day? So as you guys go ahead and share that in the chat, I just want to note that, no matter what your role is at your organization, because it's really hard to kind of avoid the financial side of your organization, the overarching goal of this and many data arts workshops is to help you understand and embrace financial data and financial processes so that it can support your work, whether your primary focus is finances or not. Great. Okay. Great. So we have a couple of board members. Thank you guys for sharing. Yes, many hats, a board member and entering all financial data. And I'm just going to encourage you to continue to share in the chat as we proceed, because it's nice to know, who's in the room and who we're talking to, so that we can understand what people are up to. Development directors, a lot of board members. That's exciting. So thank you guys all for sharing. Okay. So to begin with, we're going to talk about the idea of financial data organization. What do I mean when I say that? So we all know what financial data is, right? It's the information about all the money that comes in or goes out of your organization that's recorded somewhere in detail, including dollar amounts, why you got the money, how you spent the money, the impact of all of these ins and outs on your bank account. The organization part of financial data organization is thinking about when you're recording financial information, where are you storing that information, and how you are recording the information, including how much detail you'll record when you track all that data. The ultimate goal is that all of your financial information should be accurate, findable, and useful to you later on. Now, we all know in theory that it's a good idea to track financial data, but it's also time consuming when you have a ton of other things to do every day, or maybe you don't have very many staff. It's hard to sometimes find the resources to devote to it. But this is something that comes up for me a lot at home in my non-work life. Maybe this happens to you. There's always this moment when I'm looking for a piece of paper, maybe a bill that I need. I know I've seen it. I know it arrived at my house, but I can't put my hands on it. So I spend a lot of time looking for it, kind of running around, searching in different places when I have a lot of things to do, and I could have been spending that time more productively if I knew where it was. So, one thing that always helps me when I'm able to do this is that when I receive something, instead of randomly putting it in a pile somewhere, I put it in a specific place where I know it's going to be ready for me to use later. And so this same thing we can think about happening at our work life. So it might be something like maybe a board member calls you up if you're a fundraising professional or an executive director, and that board member is going to an event and they know they're going to see a donor who used to give to your organization. And so they want to know about that donor's history so that they are fully informed for this conversation. I know everyone dreams of getting that call from their board members. In this situation, if your data is well organized, sufficiently detailed, finding that information could be very simple. You might run a report in your accounting software, do a sort in your contribution spreadsheet, and you'll be able to give them that answer right away as you're on the phone. But if your data is in disarray, or it's not detailed enough, or it's not entered anywhere at all, you'll probably have to rely on your memory, or maybe set aside a significant chunk of time to wade through old emails or checks that you've received so that you can find it. We could find lots of other examples like this as you run your organization. One great example is filling out the CDP. I know that's a moment when having your data organized can be really helpful. And so they come up a lot, right? And so in the end, I know it sounds a little counterintuitive, but the busier you are, the more it's worth taking the time to keep your financial data organized and up to date, so that you can find things when you need them, and so that you can increase the time you have available for more high priority and pressing tasks, because you've invested a little bit of time to get your financial data organized. So let's talk about a few elements of financial data organization. So as your organization's fiscal year and just your year progresses, you're doing your work, money comes in and goes out of your organization. Every time that happens, there's a financial transaction, or what I call an accounting event. So these are all examples of accounting events. Someone buys something like a ticket, or maybe pays a workshop fee, or someone at your organization makes a purchase of supplies for your work. Every financial transaction that happens like this has to be written down and recorded in some way. And so we're going to talk about some record keeping best practices. So you may have financial information that kind of is originally captured or shows up in various places, from receipts that you receive to bank statements to invoices that you are sent via email. Now many of us are kind of working from home and maybe also at an office, so you might have electronic and paper records in a couple of places. Ideally, all of that information needs to be collected into a single place. One place for paper records, one file for digital records and scans, and one accounting system. Just getting into the habit of recording all of your financial information in a spreadsheet is a great way to start on your journey to good financial management. So if you are a small or new organization and you don't have QuickBooks yet, that's okay. But just because you don't have something in place yet doesn't mean you can't get started with a spreadsheet. And as your organization grows, you might consider free or low-cost accounting software to help you easily generate financial reports. The reason why this is critical is because you can't use or learn from your financial information if you can't find it. So work towards a single system that everyone uses, whether one person does all the data entry or multiple people have access to one secure online spreadsheet or accounting software. You really need one place that everyone who needs to have access can get to. However you choose to record the data, it's best to record all financial information as soon as possible after the accounting event. But we know the reality that's not always possible. Maybe you don't have a really high volume of financial activity, so it doesn't make sense to stop all other work and do a tiny amount of data entry exactly when things happen. Or maybe you have an all-volunteer organization. I saw a couple of folks who were board treasurers in the call, so you may be fully employed elsewhere. You may have another job and you're doing your bookkeeping once a week or once a month even, and so it just can't happen right away after those accounting events take place. If this sounds like a familiar situation to you, instead of processing every financial transaction immediately, you want to make sure that you're collecting all your financial documentation in one place so that you can access it when you need it. So as you collect all that financial documentation, so you get a receipt, you get an invoice, before you file it away to use later, before you walk away from it, think about the minimum information that someone not familiar with your organization would need to record it, like what the expense was for, why you got that check. Jot that information down on a note to accompany the records. So before you go on to something else, you put that in your file for later. Just write down what you need to know to do the data entry later. This way, you or whoever does your bookkeeping can work on recording those transactions later, and the key information won't be lost because time has gone by. If you have several people who make purchases or receive checks, consider using standard forms anytime someone needs to make a financial transaction so that all these details are collected in the same way. This could be a piece of paper someone fills out when they give you a receipt. It could be a standard set of questions they have to include in an email when they send you a receipt, or it could be an online form that you set up. You might use this for purchase orders, check requests, or expense reports, for example, but just something so that you know that the information that, again, you need to track that financial transaction is with the receipt or the record. Whether you record all your financial transactions right away or do it weekly or on any other schedule, how you need to use that data later on should determine how you record it upfront. And I'm going to talk about this idea several times throughout this webinar. So I know many of you attended our webinar a couple weeks ago when we talked about the budget process. We talked about how to think through and write down the financial implications of all the things you do. So your programs, the people that you work with, the places where you work, as well as your organizational goals for the coming year. So Monica talked about how, based on all of that, you'll work towards a budget. And this is a screenshot from the budgeting and chart of accounts template we shared with you last week, where we'll put in the chat again, and you can find that. But a budget is really only the beginning of a process on the road to financial organization. Monica mentioned last time that once you have your budget lines in place for your organization, the next step is to use those same lines and categories as you're doing your accounting all year long. This is where the chart of accounts comes into play. A chart of accounts helps you translate between your budget and your accounting system. So what is a chart of accounts? A chart of accounts is a list of all the ways money flows into your organization, all the ways you spend money, and all the ways you store your organization's capital. That might be something as simple as a bank account. Money in the bank is capital, or it could be something more complicated like investments. all of the ways you borrow capital as well as your organization's overall net worth. Put another way, it's a list of accounts that are available to record those financial transactions that we talked about earlier. Every time you record a financial transaction, at least 2 accounts on the long list that makes up your full chart of accounts are affected. So for an example, when you receive a donation and you deposit that check in the bank, you have received an individual contribution. You've also changed the amount of cash in your bank account. It increases, right, since you put the check in. So those 2 things, individual contributions and your general checking account, are 2 different lines on your organization's chart of accounts. As you think about setting up a chart of accounts, you can create one in an Excel spreadsheet or even a Word document, or whether or not you know it, if you use accounting software now, there is a chart of accounts behind the scenes that drives all of your data entry choices. You might be using kind of the default one that came with your software, or someone might have set it up years ago, and you're still using it today. But all of these can be modified at any time to suit your organization. So let's talk about the elements of a chart of accounts. At minimum, each line must contain 3 elements: a name, sometimes referred to as a general ledger account or simply an account, an account number or code, and an account type. Even if some of these account names seem self-explanatory to you, you may find it useful to add some other details like a brief description of the account, as you can see here. You could even add additional accounting details like which financial statement the account flows into, or whether a debit or credit increases or decreases the value of that line in your accounting software. There are 5 main account types on a chart of accounts. We have assets, which is everything your organization owns. We have liabilities, which is everything your organization owes. Net assets, which is sort of your net worth. And if you're going to put it in personal accounting terms, this is also called equity in for-profit organizations. So if you're using an accounting software that's not specifically for nonprofits, you might see the term equity. We have revenue and expenses. All of the lines in your chart of accounts are going to fall into one of these account types. The account number associated with each line in your chart of accounts might be a simple string of a few digits or a longer multi-segmented number. So the main account number usually has 4 or 5 digits, depending on the complexity of your organization. And you can assign the numbers in any way you like, but often what you see here is pretty typical. So asset categories start with 1, liabilities start with 2, net assets with 3, revenue with 4, and expenses with 5 through 9. The lines in your chart of accounts can be as numerous and detailed as you like, depending on what you need to know later. So let's take a quick example with revenue. So you can break down revenue into smaller chunks like earned revenue, which is all the money you earn from your programs and other services you provide, contributed revenue for all of your grants and donations, and investment revenue for any savings accounts you have, or any thing you earn in terms of interest. But you can also break those down further. So earned revenue might have detailed line items like ticket sales, workshop fees, tuition revenue, etc. And these line items should be aligned with your organization's programming. When setting up or reviewing your chart of accounts, the main things you want to keep in mind are what you want to learn from your data, as well as which reports beyond the typical financial statements will be useful later on. You'll also want to think and look at the budget you came up with, because you want them to align. It can be hard to know ahead of time exactly what you'll need to know, but it's worth taking some time to think about it, because how your chart is set up has a direct correlation to the reports you can run from any kind of accounting software package. So very similarly to what Monica talked about with the budget process, this is a moment when you'll want to talk to your staff and board. So think about your own work, what financial information will help you do your work, what financial information will help your board do its work, and what kind of financial analysis would be helpful to staff members if you have any at your organization. So for example, if your organization has different types of programs that maybe one person at the organization really understands the differences between, or if you do work in different locations, maybe you get donations from multiple sources and kind of the distinctions between those groups are really evident to the person who does the fundraising. You'll want to think about all those things when setting up your chart of accounts. So you'll need those people as part of the conversation to help you understand those nuances. You should also consider how you need to report your data. Are there specific reports you typically need to prepare for grants? Do you fill out the cultural data profile regularly for your grant reporting? Your chart of accounts and your accounting system itself need to be set up to handle all of these situations to really make things easier for you down the line. So how do we do that? How do we actually set up this chart of accounts? So first, in your chart of accounts, you'll group income and expense accounts into related sets of accounts, consisting of a summary or parent account and detailed sub-accounts. So let's look at a couple of examples here. So you could create the following account grouping: office expenses as the parent account with sub-accounts for office supplies, postage, and printing. Or on the revenue side, maybe you have a parent account called contributions, and then you have sub-accounts for individual in-kind contributions, corporate, foundation, government, etc. So if your chart of accounts is organized like this into logical groupings of parent accounts and sub-accounts, then you can go ahead and produce reports in two formats. You can produce reports in an expanded format where you'll see all the sub-accounts with their balances. It's going to be very detailed for those who need a lot of detail. Or you can do a collapsed or summary format where sub-accounts are rolled up into their parent accounts. That might be more what you're used to using for your CDP or grant report. And so these two levels of reports might be good for different groups of stakeholders at your organization. So for example, if you have a finance committee who reviews, every detail of your finances, they'll need an expanded report that shows all the details. But maybe your full board only needs to see the more collapsed summary format so that they can get an idea of the big picture at its meetings quarterly. So those are just some examples of why it's useful to have this organization of parent accounts and sub-accounts so you have more flexibility in your reporting. Let me show you how this works in the data entry process. So whether you're using accounting software or even just using a spreadsheet with your chart of accounts available as a drop-down menu if you're just getting started, this procedure is going to be the same. So we'll use contributions as an example. You have your parent account and sub-account set up in your chart. When you're getting ready to enter donations you receive, never link any of your donations to that main contributions parent account. You always want to choose one of the sub-accounts underneath. So notice here that those accounts I mentioned at the top are following this system. So all of the sub-accounts under contributed revenue start with the same two numbers as contributed revenue does, 40. So we're kind of using that system where we have the two numbers on those accounts are the same. This way, so if you're doing your contributions this way, you can run a report on all the contributions account and see all the transactions under that contributions heading. So that's going to be a summary report. Or you can run a report on one of the specific sub-accounts to do a detail analysis on that category only. The list of accounts organized into parent accounts and sub-accounts will be the primary way you track financial transactions. So I'm going to talk a little bit here and take a moment to share some advice about those account codes. And I do see there's a question about them. So I'm gonna get to your question, but I'll kind of wrap up talking about them. But thank you for your question, Razia. So I want to take a moment here. So when you're thinking about account codes, I know that they can seem a little bit intimidating when you're first starting to learn about a chart of accounts, or even if you've been working with QuickBooks or seeing your statements from your treasurer and you've been kind of ignoring the account codes. I totally get it. That's how it was for me at first. But all those codes are as a numerical system to keep your list organized. So if you have ever used a library or been to a library and looked up a book using the Dewey Decimal System, you have actually used a system that's very similar. And following a few simple rules of thumb will help you work with these account codes effectively. So first, when you're thinking about account codes, keep related accounts near one another. This is as simple as making sure related accounts start with the same numbers. So we already talked about how all your revenue accounts should start with the same number. In this example, 4, right? And then we looked at how the parent account contributions and all its sub-accounts start with the same 2 numbers, in this case, 40. So if you think about a library, if a librarian gets a new book, they wouldn't just want to add every new book that came in at the end of the shelf, because then we would never be able to find anything. Similarly, as you add or have to add new accounts to the end of your list, don't just put them at the end, but we want to slot them in where they logically belong using this numbering system. Second, as you design your chart of accounts, you want to leave space between account numbers so that your chart can grow later. For example, if I look at the line items for program service, fees and interest savings. So you can see those two account codes right here. In this example, there's 200 different numbers between those codes. So that leaves plenty of room to grow later if needed. Notice that I didn't choose, numbers that were one after the other. I'm leaving some space as I think about a chart of accounts. So as long as it follows these rules for keeping things organized, the specific numbering system you use is actually less important. So, I shared earlier a numbering system that is very common, one for assets, two for liabilities, et cetera. However, there are multiple ways that a chart of accounts can be set up. So you might see versions with different numbering systems. So if you pull up your existing chart of accounts and you see that the revenue codes all start with a different number, you don't need to panic and change it. Unlike the Dewey Decimal System, which kind of all libraries agree to use the same one, your chart of accounts is just for your organization. But you do want to make sure you're following these rules. So if you pull up your chart of accounts and you see that the revenue codes all start with a different number, that is something you might want to think about reorganizing, because if you're following these rules, it'll help keep you organized and make it easier to do your reporting. So I have a question from Razia about how important it is to have account codes. Are they specific to each org, or are they associated with industry standards? So yeah, we sort of touched on this, but I'll just kind of recap, Razia, which is that it is important to have account codes, especially if you're using accounting software. But even if you have a spreadsheet, I encourage you to start thinking about account codes, because if you ever want to move to accounting software, you'll be one step ahead, right? And they are specific to each org, but there are also general best practices that I've been talking about. So again, you can have your own account codes. You don't have to use the same ones that I'm talking about here, but you want to make sure they're kind of following these general rules for organization. And honestly, if you don't have any at all, you might just want to start with a template for arts and culture, just to get you started instead of making them up from scratch. So we'll share that template that we have with you at the end of the presentation. Okay, so we talked about adding account codes to your chart, but there are instances where you will want to add more detail to your financial data beyond just the list of accounts. So let's think about examples of this. So if we think about your ticket sales revenue, consistently using the correct account code throughout the year as you enter ticket sales that happen will help you understand your total ticket sales. That's really important for reporting and budgeting. But eventually you might actually have different types of questions come up. You might want to understand how different ticket sales differed between your fall production and your spring production. So even if you religiously tracked all your ticket sales using this account, you won't have the detail necessary to answer that question. You won't be able to compare between different productions. So if we don't plan for this in advance, you might end up having to go back through your records throughout the year to kind of retroactively determine this breakdown. You're going to be like going through all your ticket sales and trying to figure that out. And that additional work, again, is what we're trying to avoid with our financial data organization in the first place. So there may be other ways beyond this example that you want to distinguish between different types of financial data. So you might have data by grant that you got, maybe expenses by grant too, if you have restricted revenue, department. There's many different ways you may want to track your data. So for this additional detail, you can use tagging methods within your accounting software, or even within a spreadsheet, if that's where you're at, to further classify your data. So most accounting software has features to allow you to classify or tag transactions beyond just your chart of accounts. So this is sometimes referred to as dimensional accounting, or often you'll just see it referred to based on the different terminologies used in different software. So here's some examples. You might see the term classes, customers, or dimensions. Much like the chart of accounts, you will want to do some advanced thinking about what you need to track and what terminology you'll use for these tags. Then when you record your financial transactions, you will apply these tags in addition to choosing an account for each transaction. This will allow you to report on your finances in multiple ways. So again, the terminology for these tags is going to vary between accounting software, and we're not actually doing a QuickBooks or any specific software training today. But since many organizations do use QuickBooks, it's worth noting that a common way to approach this with QuickBooks is to use classes for program tracking. So if you have different programs you want to track things for, and to use customers for grant tracking. Or if you're just getting started and using a spreadsheet to track your financial data, you can simply think about adding a column for each additional type of tag you want to add. There are data validation features in Excel that can help you make sure you're using consistent set of tags as you enter data. And again, I know for a small organization, getting things into a spreadsheet is the first step, right? And that's totally okay. But just because you're using a spreadsheet doesn't mean you can't apply some of these concepts that will set you up for success if you're ever ready to kind of move over to accounting software. So if we think back to our budget training, one example we shared was a budget that's broken down by different programs, as well as general and administrative and fundraising expenses. So this breakdown, it might also be familiar to you from your 990 or from the cultural data profile. So if we look at this budget layout, your chart of accounts with those account codes that I mentioned are going to correspond to the line items in your budget. Here I have our revenue sources highlighted. This is why it's so important that your chart of accounts aligns with your budget. But that's not the only kind of dimension on this budget spreadsheet, as we can see. So the tags and classes we just discussed are going to correspond with the columns in your budget, or maybe on the CDP or your 990. So this is how we can create a budget like this that presents your revenue and expenses by line items and by program or function. I also want to mention another method for this sort of tagging or adding additional detail to your chart of accounts that you might encounter. You might hear about something being used called account code segments. So account code segments accomplish a very similar goal as those tags or classes we just discussed, but it's a slightly different system. What account code segments are numerical codes you can add on to the end of your account numbers to further classify your data by program or grant. So in this example, the organization has set up codes for their various programs. We can see them here. And they can use those codes as they enter ticket sales to track ticket sales for each program by appending those codes to the end of the account codes. So we get sort of a more complicated, longer code that has a lot of information kind of embedded in it. So account code segments can be used for various aspects of your organization, like location, program, restriction category, anything like that. I do want to say that this method of account code segments was very commonly used in the past, but now it's not as frequently used. It tends to make your chart of accounts very long, and it's actually a lot easier to use some of the tagging features that a lot of the modern accounting software has. So if you're starting from scratch or working on your chart of accounts, it's usually a much better practice to use those features like classes and jobs for this kind of detailed tracking. So if you're starting from scratch, don't worry about this. However, I did want to mention account code segments because you may encounter them if you have an existing chart of accounts, or you might still be using this method at your organization. And that's totally fine. This works. It's just a little bit more, it just makes it a little bit more complicated of a chart of accounts in the end. So whichever method you use, segments, classes, jobs, dimensions, or whatever your software calls it, as long as your data entry is accurate and detailed up front, these features can help you produce those more specific reports. So then you can start to understand not only your totals for each line item, but how different programs or departments of your organization are performing on a financial basis. So I want to get to a few best practices and things to think about as you're working on your chart of accounts, and then we'll have more time for questions before we wrap up today. So if you don't already have a chart of accounts, or if you think you need to redo your existing chart of accounts, you sort of want to do a refresh, you don't have to start from scratch. You can consider, much like we talked about with budgeting, consider working from a template. So we have developed a sample chart of accounts and budget template it's based on the cultural data profile. So it sort of aligns with our line items in our cultural data profile, which I'll take a second and explain the cultural data profile. It's a survey that organizations fill out every year, often used in grant reporting. It's also used for the research that we do to help the sector. And if you do fill out the CDP, you'll have access to reports on how your organization is doing, as Brian mentioned. So if you're filling out the CDP, you might want to consider using the template that we have, because it will get you set up to sort of fill out the CDP pretty easily going forward. And we'll send you that template in a follow-up email after this training. And I think Rochelle also put it in the chat. So this resource that we'll share with you allows you to start again from the line items in the cultural data profile and then modify them to suit your organizational needs. So whatever template you use, you want to use that as a starting point, and then go ahead and make any changes to reflect your organization's kind of specific work and the unique things that you do. But even if this particular one that aligns with the CDP is not a good fit for you, a simple internet search of nonprofit chart of accounts will give you lots of options. There are other Excel templates you can download, and just like working with the budget template, once you find a model you like, make sure you take time to modify it and suit the needs of your organization. But this way, you're not starting from scratch. You want to make sure the lines on your budget correlate to the lines on your chart of accounts. Again, just reviewing here some of these key ideas. We have combined our chart of accounts and budget template into one spreadsheet to help you keep the two aligned. But even if you aren't using our tool, this alignment is essential. It's going to make generating budget to actual reports throughout the year and all the activities related to budgeting that Monica talked about so much easier if you have that alignment between your chart of accounts and your budget. So once you've created a chart of accounts in Excel, once you're happy with it, most accounting software packages will allow you to import your Excel chart of accounts into the software. So it can be the basis of your accounting rather than whatever default the system gives you. And so that would be the next step if you're using accounting software. But again, I do want to say one more time that if you're a small organization and you currently use a spreadsheet to track your financial information, or if you don't use a spreadsheet and you're thinking about starting that, you can still set up a chart of accounts, and you really should, because having that in place, having this way to keep your financial information more organized and more easily able to be retrieved will still help you, even if you're not using accounting software. It'll help you generate kind of basic statements from that spreadsheet, and it may also make the transition to accounting software down the line much easier. So whether you're using Excel or any software for your accounting, you can also modify your chart of accounts at any time. It's yours to change, but it's worth thinking about when and how you do that. It shouldn't necessarily be a free-for-all, and let's sort of talk about why. So why would you want to change this? So let's say your organization is a theater, and over the course of the year, you have a season of shows. And so in the way that many organizations do, you sell single tickets to individual shows, and you have a subscription package for your shows. So as all that money comes in, right now in your chart of accounts, you only have a line for ticket sales. So you just recorded all those ticket sales in your accounting software. But sometime over the course of the year, you're working with your staff and you're trying to decide how much of your advertising budget you should spend to attract new subscribers and how much you should spend to attract new single ticket buyers. So if you don't have a way of differentiating between those two pools of revenue, the single ticket sales and the subscription sales, it's really hard to tell how financially successful each program has been, and even begin to know where your advertising dollars should go. So that is a moment where you might decide to create a new line in your chart of accounts for subscription sales. And from that moment forward, when you do your data entry, you'll start tracking the two types of ticket buyers separately so that you have the data you need for the analysis later on. So in terms of making changes to an established chart of accounts, here are a couple things to think about. First, you have to decide when to make the changes. And if you decide to track things differently in the middle of a fiscal year and sort of immediately add some new lines to your chart of accounts, you're going to need to decide if this new need for detail is so pressing that you need to update old transactions to take advantage of the new lines, or if it's sufficient to just track data in more detail from that moment going forward. And again, this is just going to depend upon how pressing this need is and how much time you're willing to invest to get that detailed data from historic transactions. No matter when you make the change to your chart of accounts and track more detailed data in your accounting software, until you have a couple years of financial data with those new lines, you won't really have trend data. So just keep that in mind. So here you can see what it might look like if we made this change from year to year. We'll have just a different way of looking at the data in the second year. So any trend analysis we're doing, it just won't quite show the accurate trend. So especially if you're a new or growing organization, I encourage you to think ahead about what your needs would be before you set up your chart of accounts, but you can't think of everything, let's be honest. So if that's you, if you're new and growing, or you're just starting to set up a chart of accounts, you may also want to think about a procedure for making changes to your chart of accounts. So one thing you might think about is collecting feedback from anyone who uses your financial data about the lines and sections of your chart of accounts. You could talk about this at the end of the fiscal year, maybe with the board or over the course of your fiscal year. And then one idea is to sort of wait till you finish one accounting year and close your books and designate that as the moment to make any and all changes to your chart of accounts. Because even then, you may not have those trends from year to year, but at least you'll know that all the changes happened at the end of a fiscal year. So one caveat that I want to make about having a very detailed and specific chart of accounts is to make sure that you're thinking about a level of detail that is useful instead of merely being interesting. I think the data is interesting, inherently interesting. That's why I work at SMU Data Arts. But I'm sure all of you have had this experience of maybe like designing a survey. And when you're first designing that tool, it's very exciting to brainstorm things that you could collect and things that you could learn. And you end up with a very long survey that not many people wanted to fill out. And then when you go to look at the survey results, you found that you actually only used like 1 or 2 of those questions to make a decision or put in a grant report, and the rest was just kind of extra. And so this is kind of an example of this phenomena that when you're talking about these things, it's easy to get really excited about the different accounts you could track. But you want to make sure that you're checking in with your staff and your board about the data they really need for planning. Make sure that everything on your chart of accounts has a purpose. And so, for every addition to the chart of accounts you want to make along the way, make sure that everyone kind of can name specific ways you'll use that data. Otherwise, you might be tempted to kind of overcomplicate your system. Finally, take the time to review your chart of accounts periodically. You may find that you have accounts you haven't used in a while and are unlikely to use going forward, and you can actually archive some of those accounts to keep it less complicated. All right, so here's what we've learned about creating a chart of accounts and some ideas for making it work for your organization. Coming up with the right chart of accounts for your organization might take some trial and error. It takes some back and forth with people. It's the kind of task that you can't just sit down and do in an hour, unfortunately. And the time it takes might seem like a luxury, but it's time well spent, because having well-organized data that actually tells you what you need to know will help you do things like learn whether your programs are financially successful, generate the financials needed for a grant report much faster, analyze your contributions by source to help you plan your fundraising activities, and the list goes on and on. We want to get staff involved from the beginning. You need their buy-in because they are critical to making your systems work. If you design a system that no one likes, they're probably not going to use it. So make sure all staff members who interact with the financial side of your organization have a copy of your chart of accounts and kind of understand these financial practices that you have in place for tracking. Create internal systems for handling payments and revenue receipts that track back to your chart of accounts. So this means that every time you or anyone buys something for the organization or pays a bill or receives an invoice, at least write or type or append to that record the account name, maybe supplies or electric bill, whatever the account name is. And remember, if everyone has a copy of your chart of accounts, they should be able to find the right chart. And more detail, including the account number if possible. All of this will lead to more accurate data entry and better reporting later on. You want to use accounts and sub-accounts in your chart so you can produce summary and detail reports. You'll also want to use features like account code segments, classes, jobs, or tagging so you can analyze your data in many ways when you need to. And finally, just to acknowledge that all of this meta work takes time and often feels less pressing than maybe like the program that's coming up next week or addressing other things that have come up in your day-to-day or as an organization, but it is an investment in the future of your organization. So what we've done in this session is cover 2 key building blocks of financial management: keeping your financial data organized and using a chart of accounts to organize and make the most of your financial data. And this session builds on the information we covered last week with 2 weeks ago with Monica about the annual budgeting process. As we said at the beginning, this session was a really basic overview to get you started, but depending on the complexity of your organization, we know you may find yourself needing more resources. So we want to recommend a couple. So strongnonprofits.org is a resource from the Wallace Foundation that was produced with FMA, or Fiscal Management Associates. They have an overview of financial operations, which is targeted at mid-size and larger organizations. So if you're large enough to think about having a CFO or other fiscal officer, this is going to be information that's really helpful to you. But even if you're smaller, it sometimes can be helpful to just take a read so that you know the scope of financial management activities at a slightly larger organization, especially if you think you might grow over time. We didn't get too far into how to track restricted revenue today, just that, that idea of tagging is what's going to help you do that. So if that is something you have at your organization, you have a need to track restricted grants and expenses associated with those grants, I recommend this resource from Propel Nonprofits. And finally, I know that, from talking to arts leaders over the years, from volunteering myself at several nonprofits, that a lot of people who are organizing the financial data at nonprofits are self-taught. You've figured out how to do these things on your own. So I know there are so many resources on topics like bookkeeping or QuickBooks. So I just want to invite everyone, if you have any resources that you have found particularly helpful, I encourage you to put them in the chat right now, and we'll collate them and share them out with the group, because there's a lot out there, but some of it's better than others. So if you have anything that you've really enjoyed, feel free to share. I want to wrap up with just a few other data arts tools and resources that offer you different ways to work with and gain insights into your financial data. So I did mention the cultural data profile, but I just want to take a moment to talk a little bit more about it. This is a survey that's based on your final financial statements for each fiscal year. You can enter data into the cultural data profile at the end of each fiscal year. And then once you've done that, your data can be used for grant applications with participating grant makers. It's also used to support research on the cultural sector. And you also have access to reporting tools. So once your data is entered, you'll have access to a full suite of reports that can help you analyze your trend data in a number of areas. It also can help you compare your organization to others. So you can see, for example, how maybe your fundraising information compares to other organizations of a similar size to you around the country. These reports also allow you to have ready-made data and visuals available for your board meetings. We also have other tools, including the KIPI dashboard, which is a more kind of advanced benchmarking tool, and is a great way to have a conversation about all the intangible things that contribute to your organization's success. If you want to learn more about using data in general, we have a series of free online courses that are meant to help you learn to use data more effectively, and Rochelle or Monica will put a link in the chat to those courses. We also have a number of online videos available on our Vimeo page, and that's also where we'll put this recording of today's session, which we'll also send you a link to. I mentioned at the top that we're also a research center at SMU Data Arts, and so we regularly publish research in the form of white papers, blog posts, and academic papers. Our recent work has covered topics from, modeling ticket demand in the sector during the COVID-19 pandemic, a recent white paper about how funding and marketing patterns intersect with audience DEI. We recently had a series of blog posts examining giving trends during the pandemic. We're kind of always releasing research that is based upon your CDP data and other data sources. We do have a few projects coming up, which we're excited about. We're going to be releasing our Arts Vibrancy Index in December, and we'll have a white paper on psychological safety and inclusion in the arts workforce early next year. So my colleagues are going to put a link to our research page in the chat if you want to check out our research. And I also encourage you to, subscribe to our newsletter or follow us on social if you want to hear about new research as it comes out. And all that information will be in the follow-up email. So that's our presentation for today. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to either ask them out loud or put them in the chat. Monica, was there anything in the chat that I missed that we should cover?
You did not. You covered all of the questions that came in.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we have a few minutes. So, I'd encourage you, if you have anything on your mind that you're curious about, feel free to share, and you can use the chat or go ahead and just ask out loud. Contact email. Yes, so we'll send out an email with a follow-up, but I'm going to put my email in the chat, and you're welcome to send me questions. And we also have, if you want to send me questions about today's session, please feel free. We also have a support center. So if you are filling out your cultural data profile, I highly recommend the support center for assistance. Sorry, typing while talking. That's the email address for the support center.
Good morning. Thank you for the presentation. I have one question. We're actually we've created a book and then we're selling the book, and then we're kind of struggling with how to track that. We're working with a treasurer and trying to figure out is cost of goods sold a way to do that. We had to purchase the books, and
Yeah.
so it's a little bit tricky for us just trying to track that.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously cost of goods sold is a common way to do that. I know, are you working with a professional accountant, or is it sort of someone on your organization who does accounting?
Just a volunteer.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I do think cost of goods sold is a very frequent way that people do that. If you said you're producing the book and you're buying it from like a printing organization?
Correct.
Yeah. So I think there are ways to kind of track the cost of goods sold. There are ways to reflect the value of that inventory on your balance sheet, which you might want to think about. So, if you purchase a bunch of books which you expect to sell, that's also an asset to your organization. So, there's a couple of things you might want to think about. You'll want to think about how you track when you buy the books, which is how cost of goods sold comes in. You want to track the revenue when you sell the books. So that would be another chart of accounts. And then I also would encourage you to talk with your accountant about, is there a way that we reflect the value of the books we have sitting in the office on our balance sheet? And often it depends, it's going to depend on the specifics. And I'm happy if you want to email me, I can find some resources for you about that. And I have to say, I'm not a professional accountant, so but I know your volunteer isn't either. But yeah, I think those are the things to keep in mind. Try to think about, when do we spend money on the books, when do we get money on the books, and also we want to reflect often that value of what's sort of the inventory that we have. So that might be a direction to head.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. I just see a question from Jason. Okay. Yes, Jason. So this is a really great question. So Jason is asking if you have a printing cost that's specifically for fundraising, how are you going to track that? This is sort of why we have that sort of two-dimensional system that I'm talking about, because so many of our expenses are going to have what we call a natural line item. So it's printing, right? That's what it is. But it also has sort of a different aspect that we want to keep track of. And so, instead of sort of debating, we have you might have a fundraising expenses account code on your list, right? And then you might also have a printing account code. And then you kind of get into this place where you're like, we have these two account codes where this thing could go. How do we decide? And so what's useful about moving to this system of multiple dimensions is that you will have account codes for those, what we call like natural line items. So if it's printing, it goes in the printing line. But then you'll have those tags for the kind of other elements that we're talking about. So it is printing that is for the purpose of fundraising, right? So fundraising, we call that like a function. It's a functional category. So, what is the function of the expense? And so ideally, you kind of get to a place where you use the printing line, but you're also maybe applying a fundraising tag or class or something like that. So yeah, and that sort of helps you avoid some of this confusion, right? And then when you go to produce your financial statement, you can produce something that kind of looks like you might see in the CDP, where you have a printing line, but it's divided into 3 columns for administrative, fundraising, and programs. So then you can kind of immediately see in one statement how much you spent on printing as a total, but how much of that was specific to fundraising and specific to programs. So that's sort of, it's actually a really classic example of why it's useful to think about these two dimensions in accounting. So I hope that answered your question. And if you want to email me to kind of go into more of the details, I'm happy to. It is very confusing though. This is why it was invented, but multi-dimensional accounting is confusing. Any other questions?
Katie, we're at the last 2 minutes of our time.
Excellent.
Together.
Okay. Thank you, Monica. Okay, so we'll go ahead and leave it there. Leora or Brian, is there anything you guys want to add before we break?
Well,
no, I don't think so, but just,
yeah.
oh, sorry,
Okay.
Leora.
Go ahead, Brian.
I just a really quick thank you all so much for showing up, and thank you to Data Arts for doing this workshop. It's very, very interesting.
Okay, thank you both. Yeah, and so you have my email. We'll send the follow-up email, and you guys are welcome to get in touch if you have any more questions. And thank you all for being here. All right.
Thanks.